and welcome to Behind the Dean's Desk, conversations from the College of Graduate and Professional Studies at the Chicago School. I'm Dr. Alisha DeWalt, Dean of the College of Graduate and Professional Studies. This series is designed to highlight our community voices, ideas, and professional impact that shape our graduate and professional programs. In each episode, we step away from formal titles and curricula to have a real conversation about the work we do, why it matters, and how it connects to practice in the field. All right, well, welcome everyone. Today I'm joined by Dr. Tyler Ray, a faculty member in the Behavioral Analysis Division. Tyler's research alongside his students really explores how leadership practices shape teams, organizations, and ultimately the quality of care delivered in real world settings. So Tyler, thank you for being here today, and thanks for joining me behind the Dean's Desk.
Yeah, thank you. I'm very honored to be able to share a lot of the work that actually my students are working on, and super excited to kind of highlight the things that we're learning.
Wonderful. Well, Tyler, I thought we could start with level setting on what applied behavioral analysis is. It's one of our largest divisions at the Chicago School. And I think when people think about behavioral analysis, many go directly to working with individuals with autism, working in that therapy setting. I know I did in my undergrad career, work in that space as well. Could you frame what behavioral analysis is and how we apply it to other applications?
Yeah, of course. So this is actually one of my favorite topics because behavior analysis, as you mentioned, we're known as the autism treatment field, right?
Yeah.
But what people don't actually realize is how much behavior analytic research have applied to a variety of things. So, for instance, one study from, I want to say the 80s, early 90s is Scott Geller. And what he ultimately did was he was called into a local mall. And it was back in the days where everybody was smoking. And so the fire department was getting called to malls all the time, right? Because people were putting their cigarette butts in the trash, their trash in the ashtrays, and there were just fires, rampant fires, right? So the whole aim of what he ended up doing was a great synopsis of what our field is. And what it is looking at those environmental variables, adjusting those environmental variables to seek or evoke a different type of behavior. So what his study did was he adjusted where the ashtray was compared to a trash can. He had them right next to each other. He had them across the median or the little pavilions within the malls. He adjusted it so that the ashtray was on top of the trash can, had a bunch of different variations, and ultimately found that the main issue was that people were using the receptacles for the wrong use, right? So trash was going in the ashtray, cigarette butts were going in the trash can, and the simple manipulation of putting the ashtray on top of the trash can led to a significant reduction in fires in the mall. And so I know that that's a really outside there study that was done. But I think it's a really great picture of how it can be applied to a much wider issue. There's been other studies on increasing seatbelt usage. I think it was John Austin back in 96, if I recall correctly. There's been community health studies. There's health, sport, and fitness. There's policy change. So Derek Reed did a study on tanning and self-tanning in the tanning beds, and used behavioral economics to evaluate what percent of attacks would impact the occurrence or usage of tanning beds within college towns. And we all know that tanning beds typically are going to lead to some or increase the likelihood of skin cancer, right? And so his whole thing was how do we address this issue? And so it was merely what level tax would have to be implemented to reduce the use of tanning beds, which then would ultimately, in the grand scheme of things, reduce the occurrence of skin cancer in the larger population. So there's just such a wide breadth of research that we're doing that's really exciting. I'm going to cite just one last study and highlight a study that Dr. Amanda Mahoney, one of my colleagues in the Behavior Analysis Division, she and Alan Poling ended up doing a study in, I can't remember which African country, but they ended up training Nutria to sniff out bombs so that they could go and clear a field so that it was safe for local communities to walk through these fields for obviously safety. So the application of behavior science and behavior analysis is pretty far-fetched, despite that our field is just known for the autism treatment.
That's so fascinating. Thank you for citing those studies. I wouldn't, know, I think about the organizational piece, which we'll talk about soon, but truly the breadth of where behavioral sciences can be applied is fascinating. And from a career outcomes perspective, right? And getting that master's degree, there's so many different places and spaces you can be. So thank you.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, Tyler, I'd love for you to talk about what you do specifically in this field. Can you share like what your focus is from a research perspective?
Yeah, so over the years, I feel like the background is kind of important, but over the years,
Absolutely.
I started in like as a behavior technician, but back then there wasn't that title. So I started working with kids with autism, and then I ended up becoming board certified, and then started supervising others, and then worked into a clinical director role and leadership roles. And the one thing that I kept coming back to is, even though our field's focus has always been on autism, what our time spent on is staff development, right? And so as a supervising BCBA in a clinical setting, I may be writing a plan for somebody to implement for the client, right? But a majority of my time is checking to ensure that that staff member is following the plan. So there's treatment integrity, which then leads into performance management. Performance management is a subdomain of what's called organizational behavior management. And so that is one of the areas that I feel like is a really direct path for many BCBAs to dip their toes into OBM. And so when I started seeing this kind of shift, my research really focused more on staff development. So like my dissertation was training teachers to train paraprofessionals to implement a classroom management system, right? And so what I was able to look at was looking at, first off, am I training the teacher effectively to both implement the skill, but also implement the training practices? Did those teachers then implement the training practices with their staff? And then as a team, were they able to implement that classroom management system within the classroom? And then how did that impact the student, right? So my research has kind of always focused on multi-tiered systems of how do we intervene at the supervisor or leadership level, move to the employee or staff member level, and then how does that impact any service delivery or organizational outcomes. And so that's really where a lot of my research has been going, especially with the mentorship that I'm providing with my students. So like, for instance, I have one student, Valeria Pascale, who is actually in Naples or Salerno, Italy. And she is getting ready to propose her dissertation in 2 weeks. And what we're looking at is exactly what I just described. How do we train leaders to implement task clarification, performance feedback within a human services setting, at a governmental agency, by the way? And then how does that impact the staff member? How does that impact the client the service recipient, but then how does that impact organizational outcomes of staff retention, of performance feedback situations, and a variety of variables that she'll be taking a look at. So it's
Wow.
just been really fun to see like how to impact different levels of an organization with one simple intervention at one point in the organization.
That's fantastic. It makes me think about, Tyler, like what, from like a behavioral science perspective, what have you found in your research or students found their research about what makes an effective leader? I'm always curious about the leadership
Okay.
side to all these, right? It's all intertwined. So what have you seen from the behavioral science perspective and what makes that
Yeah.
effective leader?
So now you're really getting into my bread and butter.
Okay.
Um, as I mentioned, my experience has been like working in leadership roles, trying to figure out how to support leaders in a more effective manner. Um, and I came across the research of Dr. John Austin. He's very well known. He's the one who developed the performance diagnostic checklist, which is essentially the functional behavior assessment for organizational or OBM strategies. Okay. There's
Okay.
been a variety of variations since 2000 on that. Um, and recently in 2023, I just so happen to have the book, so I'll give his little thing. Results
Nice.
is a wonderful book that his last chapter actually talks about what he calls it behavior science for leaders. And he has classified 3 different categories of behavior that any leader needs to be able to master. The first is self-management, the second is relationship management, and the third is performance management. So what my research lab is working on is trying to figure out different behaviors that we can pinpoint at each of those 3 different categories. So for instance, one of my former students, Shafali Manocha, she ended up doing a study on time management, and we found an article that was in order to effectively engage in time management, it's like the magic number of 3s, but you have to be able to schedule your time, adapt your time, or protect your time. Okay.
Okay.
So what she ended up doing
Self-reflecting here.
I regularly do as well. But what she ended up doing was first off just providing task clarification, a little bit of training to some leaders on how to structure their time. Right. We hypothesized that the activities or tasks within a work environment that were less desirable would be the ones that would be more adapted, meaning like when that task came up, something else comes up and they're like, this is more important. Let's jump to that because I don't want to do this task. But what we ultimately found out was that actually didn't have a correlation because the tasks that were undesired were like mandatory tasks, and the tasks that were more desired that would have been more protected were like the more discretionary tasks within an organization. And so it was really interesting to see how that hypothesis actually was false. And so that was really interesting. I have another student that's worked on relationship management, how to build rapport with a direct supervisee. And then I have other students, and it's more the performance management side. I feel like that's probably the area that our field has the most research on.
Yeah.
But Dr. Sarah Lalani developed 9 steps of pinpointing, like how to effectively pinpoint. And so she was one of my students and actually the co-director of my research lab. And then I have other students that are using task clarification, looking at different schedules of reinforcement and things along those lines. So as a leader, like being able to master each of those 3 skill sets, if you will, is much more complex than just saying, oh, I can manage my time. Well, what does time management look like, right? And then relationship management. How do you actually build that rapport so that those difficult discussions can be bi-directional? So that,
Yeah.
yeah.
I'm so curious on that one, Tyler, because you think about relationship management to me wouldn't have necessarily been like top of my list from a behavioral science perspective, right? I expect that in different fields where we're putting that forward and having those conversations. Can you say more about that? I'm just curious from that lens, how are you, I don't know, developing that skill set for relationship management? Like what criteria are you looking at? How are we training leaders to increase their relationships? Does
Yeah,
that make sense?
so yeah, it does. So we're actually leaning very heavily on the uh, clinical psychology side of things. It's called motivational interviewing.
Yep. Okay.
Um, Rosengren 2018, I believe, has a really great workbook that goes through all of the different types of uh, motivational interviewing contexts. I am not an expert in that area, so I can't really talk at depth about it. However, what we're doing is trying to focus on like open-ended questions, affirmations, reflections, and I forgot what S is, but for ORS, OARS.
Okay.
Um, and we are looking at teaching people to engage in those specific skills. Um,
Okay.
like the open-ended questions doesn't necessarily always have to be like, where are you going to be in 5 years within your career, right? Like it can be, hey, what are you doing with your family later? And it may be a way just to kind of create that connection that's beyond just supervisor employee relationships.
Right.
And I can't say empirically that that will definitively make any impact on rapport building skills at this time. But if you look at anecdotal and everyday interactions, the people that I am most comfortable with, I'll share a little bit more about like family life or things that I'm working that I'm not really
Yeah.
like announcing yet. And that kind of opens up the door to have some of those more difficult conversations that aren't going to be taken as like
Absolutely.
a personal attack. And so that's kind of what my former student, Dr. Rebecca Gonzalez, worked on was how do we build in some open-ended conversations during supervision times
Hmm.
to impact that relationship. And we measured that using the leadership exchange, LMX, Leader Member Exchange 7, which was originally published in 1995. I can't remember the first author's name. But it's 7 questions of what is your perception of the supervisor employee relationship, and then what is the employee's perception of the supervisor employee relationship, and then they come back and discuss how that interacts. And so it's just a really interesting way because, as you mentioned, like that's kind of a little bit outside of a
Yeah.
behavior analytic realm, right?
Yeah.
So we're targeting those specific behaviors that we can observe, but we're also using some level of self-report and perception to then back up that, okay, we saw an increase in the open-ended questions asked during supervision meetings. Did that impact this perception over here on the LMX set? And so that's kind of how we're juggling the two of having
Hmm.
some self-report, but also having the objective behavioral data.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that. That's so
Yeah.
interesting. And it's I always enjoy hearing that research backed leadership development, right? And really being able to
Mhm.
point to those behaviors. Um, it's just fascinating. So thank you.
Yeah.
I do
Of
have
course.
one more question related to your research and the work. Just curious on from your experience in organizations, what are like those most common mistakes that organizations are making when it comes to trying to improve performance of a group or a leader or trying to have more accountability within the team? What are those like common issues
Yeah.
that you've seen?
That's a really great question. And unfortunately, I don't really have a direct answer because I think there's so many variables across organizations. But I can give some examples of what I have seen.
Yeah.
So I used to work at, I'll just leave it vague, but I used to work
Yeah.
somewhere
Hmm.
and there was high turnover rates. executives, right? Our field is known for high turnover rates because it is a very demanding job, especially at the behavior technician level of working one-on-one with clients, or sometimes working through those challenging behaviors that may occur, right?
Right.
And the organization's perception was that people were resigning because they weren't getting paid enough. And while that is probably some level of what is impacting somebody to resign, that's not going to be 100% of what that is. So what we ended up doing within that organization is that a fellow BCBA and I decided to do a systems level analysis. And we looked at all of the potential variables. We ended up doing some surveys of, like, what are some things that you enjoy about your job? What are some things that really need to improve? How are you working with your supervisor, and those types of variables? And what we came to the realization of is that staff were reporting that they wanted more training on different areas of their